Unchartered Maritime Tales, the podcast where we talk all things maritime archaeology and beyond. I'm Greta.
And I'm Jasmine, and we're project officers for the Maritime Archaeology Trust, based in Southampton.
So this podcast has been created for our Fathoming the Future project, telling new stories to reach wider audiences.
Absolutely, and this week we're going to be talking all about the SS Camberwell.
So for those of you who don't know the Camberwell, it was a steamship and it sunk off the east coast of the Isle of Wight during the First World War. Now tragically, the sinking took many lives, and our volunteer Shirley is going to be talking a bit more about the crew in a moment. The vessel itself is still in situ. It appears to be relatively intact from the survey data, and you can see the remains of the bow, the winch and even the boilers. And it's also quite famous for its cargo, which is a real incredible insight into the First World War era. And Martin, who is the owner of the Shipwreck Centre in the Isle of Wight, will tell us more on that in a little bit. We actually also spoke about this recently in our workshop that we held with the Isle of Wight women. So it's come up quite a lot recently in a lot of our projects. So am I right thinking, Jasmine, that this site was included in our Forgotten Wrecks project?
Yes, it was. So the Forgotten Wrecks project ran from 2014 to 2018, and it documented over 1,100 First World War shipwrecks along the south coast of the UK.
Wow.
There were loads of volunteers involved in this project, doing everything from diving and field work, site and artefact recording, lots and lots of online research, outreach, and indeed producing lots of reports and articles as well. And most of these are now available online, as well as this massive Forgotten Wrecks database, which brings together all of that research and the findings from the project, as well as the archaeological reports, audio recordings, a bit like this one, booklets, exhibition panels, videos, 3D models, and even geocaches.
Oh, wow. Sounds like so much was done. So as Jasmine said, we do also have a site report on the Camberwell, which you can find on our website. And recently, one of our volunteers, Shirley, looked into the site of the Camberwell and the history of British empires and dominions during the First World War.
The following audio is going to be telling the story of the Camberwell's crew, many of whom were killed in the tragedy, and they were known as lascar sailors, which is a term some people might not be familiar with. Shirley, who wrote and recorded this, took a lot of her research from a booklet that was created as part of the Forgotten Wrecks project, which we previously mentioned. The booklet was written by Jessie Ransley, and it is called Black and Asian Seamen of the Forgotten Wrecks of the First World War. And again, you can find this on our website if you'd like to have a look.
And the research from this booklet is important as it puts the Camberwell and other ships into the context of empire and the global reach that the First World War had. So Shirley's first going to discuss the wider sphere of empire, then the history of lascar sailors, and then finally a section on the Camberwell ship itself.
In 1914, the British Empire may not have been the dominant economic power in Europe, but its sheer size and wealth of 61 colonies, protectorates, possessions and dominions made it very powerful indeed. Well, what is the difference between these categorisations of imperialism? A colony, otherwise known as a crown colony or royal colony, is a country or area under the full or partial political control of another country, usually a distant one and occupied by settlers from that country. Alternatively, a protectorate is where there is a country generally controlled and defended by a more powerful country. For example, Egypt under British rule from 1882 to 1914. The English overseas possessions during the Empire era were also known as the English Colonial Empire, which comprised of a variety of overseas territories, which were colonised, conquered, or otherwise acquired. The term dominion was used to refer to one of several self-governing nations of the British Empire, for example, Canada and New Zealand. In the age before air travel, nearly 2/3 of the food and drink consumed by the British population came from abroad. along with cotton, oil, rubber, and many ores and metals. This global transport and supply network fed and fueled and sustained civilian and military populations. All of this was pivotal to the war efforts. But what was the role that foreign sailors played in the success of Britain? Well, in 1914 it was estimated that 30% of the seamen in the British mercantile marine were foreign. Some were known as Asiatic, usually referring to men from Asia, and 17.5% lascars, which were either Asian or Arabic, and this was nearly 1 in 6. They made a huge contribution, and many of the lascars came from British colonies, for example, Yemeni, India, Malay, Somali, West African, Egyptian, Chinese, Burmese, Siamese, Indonesian, and West Indian. Seamen from the Indian Ocean were employed on Asiatic or lascar articles of agreement for 2 years and were paid 1/3 to 1/5 of the wage of men on standard or European articles. Most crew who were Asian or black were on irregular contracts, given smaller berths, and were given less pay and fewer rations. Whilst this meant lucrative savings for shipping companies, these men had higher rates of illness and injuries due to the poor conditions they lived and worked in. What is also important to realise is that these men had not joined the Navy, but risked their lives, and not always willingly. The imperial racial hierarchy, European ideas about race that had emerged in the 18th and 19th century regulated all of their working lives, but there were little alternatives. But where did the name lascar come from? Well, it was a European word applied to non-European seamen, a corruption of an Urdu word meaning soldier or army. It was a flexible category, as it was sometimes used for Arab, Chinese, or even African sailors. It was used to regulate their employment, but also in the 20th century to control their movement and define who was and who was not British. In a world that was deeply marked and regulated by colonial ideas about race, lascar was both an employment and race category. Lascar sailors from the East Indies were vital to the English East India Company, EIC, throughout the 17th and 18th century as it developed trading posts and fought for position in the lucrative Asian trade. During this period, over 220 EIC ships sailed from Britain, but few lascars signed on directly as crew members. Following this, the EIC tapped into well-established local maritime labour gang systems, and groups of men were supplied by employment brokers in South Asian ports. Whilst lascars were nominally free men, the British state worked continually to control and contain them. One ship that was shrouded in tragedy was the SS Camberwell. It was a general cargo ship during the First World War, transporting cargo from UK ports into ports in India, an important vessel for both the war effort and international trading. On the Camberwell's last journey in May 1917, it was carrying a routine general cargo of 5,000 tonnes to India, ports of Colombo, Madras and Calcutta. The cargo included wine, olive oil, cement, fertiliser and prepaid postcards for use by British troops stationed in India. It was en route from Middlesbrough via London to Calcutta with a crew of 65, including 2 deck apprentices. The majority of the crew were of Indian heritage, with the exception of the captain and mate. Unfortunately, on that fateful day, it was struck by 2 separate mines. The first mine damaged the vessel and caused it to sink. The second then blew the ship up. Some of the crew were picked up from lifeboats, but tragically 7 were reported as missing. All of the lost crew were from the Indian Merchant Service and are listed on the memorial in Mumbai. For further information, please consult the Trust's books on Black and Asian seamen, written as part of the Forgotten Wrecks project. This document lists the 7 lives that were lost, and all were from the Indian Merchant Service and are listed on the memorial in Mumbai. What also makes this an interesting site is the remains of the ship's cargo. Records of the goods show a wide variety and demonstrate the number of different companies that were exporting goods and materials from the UK to India. As for the submarine that had laid the mines, the UC-36, it was rammed by the French steamer Molière on the 21st of May 1917, and all lives lost, demonstrating the ongoing tragedy of the First World War.
Well, thank you to Shirley for recording that and telling us a bit more about the tragedy of the SS Camberwell.
Yeah, the story of the Camberwell and of these other vessels really demonstrates how lascars played such an important role, and yet their stories are often overlooked. Because without them, merchant vessels like the Camberwell, they wouldn't have been able to operate, let alone carry all these vital resources during the war.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's certainly something that this Fathoming project is really trying to highlight. It's really crucial to remember that this really was a world war. And something else that's also worth mentioning is that a lot of newspapers were quite belittling of lascar sailors during that time. And this is going to be something that we actually touch on in a video that will be coming out on this subject very shortly. Another thing Shirley mentioned there, she also talked about the SS Camberwell's cargo. You can actually view this as well at the Shipwreck Centre in Arreton on the Isle of Wight if you do live in the area. Even if you don't live in the area, definitely worth going to see. And for those who may not have been there, it's just an incredible museum. It's been recently accredited and there's lots of ways to enjoy it. There's exhibitions, of course, there's games for kids, there's digital trails, and all of the artefacts were brought up by Martin, and he's going to talk a little bit more now on the Camberwell's cargo.
Now, the next wreck we're going to talk about is the SS Camberwell. It's one of the first wrecks that I actually worked commercially. I mean, the Warnight was the first one in the late 60s, but when I went off and worked elsewhere and then came back, I bought a boat, and the first wreck that we actually worked, salvaging it, if you like, was the SS Camberwell. It's about 6 miles off Shanklin on the Isle of Wight, and it was mined in 1917. It carried a general cargo. Really interesting cargo, actually. One of the most interesting cargoes of wrecks around the Isle of Wight. And here you'll see some of the items from it. We've got the copper kettle, the big copper kettle, which every time I look at that, I think that brewed the tea for the crew. So it's quite a personal item. Lots of carbide headlights. The ship was en route to Ceylon and India, and there's a really mixed cargo. There's lots of little bits and pieces here that we can't talk about them all, but one of the most interesting things that we found on there were these banknotes, these 10 rupee banknotes of 1916. They're quite a rare banknote because they were quite a scarce thing. Collectors are quite interested in them, but because they'd been underwater, and amazingly they survived underwater all that time until the 1990s when I recovered these things. But all the edges obviously got waterlogged and got worn away, but you can still see, 10 rupees 1916 and all the serial numbers of those. Fascinating that they actually survived all that time underwater. Interestingly also is that on board, as well as the banknotes, there was a large quantity of quarter anna franked postcards which were being sent out to the troops in the First World War so that they could write home. So they also, is a real survival thing there. They survived really well. And you can see the franked mark on there for the postage. Also, we got varol jars, which was an old, like a malt extract. And older people remember being fed malt and cod liver oil when they were kids. Similar sort of thing, the First World War era, varol. And also some Camberwell sealing wax sticks as well. So a really interesting wreck and a fascinating cargo of a multitude of things, including wines, spirits, and all sorts of other things in the general cargo.
Great, thank you, Martin. I think the banknotes have got to be the most incredible artefacts. You obviously can't see them here, unfortunately, because we're doing an audio, but the picture of them is on our site report, and they are incredibly well preserved.
They're just really something, aren't they? I'm always so fascinated by just the sheer variety of cargo that the Camberwell was carrying. It's just a real time capsule of stuff.
Yeah, really wonderful to see those and the other artefacts that Martin mentioned in the museum, so it's definitely worth a trip if you can. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and be sure to check out our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook and TikTok now. They are all Maritime Archaeology Trust, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, bye!